Autumn winds carried the stench of desperation through Redemption Creek, a town that wore its name like a bad joke. Jacob Harlow watched from the Silver Dollar Saloon porch, one boot propped on the railing, as townspeople shuffled toward the auction house. Today, they'd sell women instead of cattle. His gray eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his Stetson. At 35, Jacob owned more Wyoming territory than most men would see in a lifetime. The Double H Ranch stretched beyond horizons. 15,000 acres of prime grazing land that had made him richer than any man in 3 counties. Yet wealth hadn't softened the hard lines of his face or the cold calculation in his gaze. "Another auction today," Tom Brennan said, joining him on the porch. Tom had been Jacob's foreman for 8 years. The closest thing to a friend a man like Jacob allowed himself. "Seems that way." Jacob sipped his whiskey, the amber liquid burning a familiar path down his throat. "Heard there's a new one. Folks are calling her the Mystery Widow. Came in on yesterday's stage. Covered head to toe in black. Won't show her face to nobody." Jacob grunted. The widow auctions had become a grim ritual. Desperate women standing on platforms while men bid for the right to take them home. Marriages of convenience sealed with the strike of Judge Morrison's gavel. "These women aren't cattle, Tom," Jacob said quietly, "but out here, what's the difference? Both get branded, worked, and traded when convenient." Tom spat tobacco juice into the street. Since when did Jacob Harlow grow a conscience? Inside the saloon, rough laughter swelled as men placed bets on which woman would fetch the highest price. Jacob had never participated. His ranch ran smoothly, and his bed was never empty when he wanted company. The auction wasn't scheduled to start for another hour, but anticipation hummed through town like approaching thunder. Jacob drained his glass and nodded toward the door. Might as well watch the spectacle. By the time they reached the auction house, the wooden benches were filled with ranchers, miners, and shopkeepers. Judge Morrison stood on the platform, checking his pocket watch with self-importance. Jacob leaned against the back wall, arms crossed over his chest. First came the women he recognized: Sarah Mills, widowed by a mining collapse; Betty Donovan, abandoned with 3 children; young Annie Peterson, barely 19, selling herself to escape frontier poverty. Then she appeared. The crowd hushed as the mystery widow stepped onto the platform. Unlike the others, hunched with shame, she stood tall. Black fabric covered her from head to toe, a thick veil obscuring her face. Black gloves concealed her hands. She moved with peculiar grace, like a shadow given form. "Gentlemen," Judge Morrison announced, recovering his bluster, "this widow prefers her privacy. She's educated, literate, capable of running a household, name withheld until arrangements are made." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "What's she hiding?" someone shouted. "Probably diseased," another jeered. "Ugly as sin, most like." A third called out to general laughter. Jacob found himself moving forward, though he hadn't intended to. He reached the front just as the judge cleared his throat. "Shall we start at $20? Morrison asked, sweat beading on his forehead. When no one bid, he lowered the price. 10. The widow's gloved hands trembled slightly, the first crack in her composed facade. "Hey, Harlow." The voice belonged to Buck Watson, a rival rancher whose cattle operation bordered the Double H. Watson swaggered forward, whiskey fumes preceding him. "Got a proposition for you," Watson said, grinning like a coyote. "I'll bet you $300 you can't get that crow to shed her feathers. 200 extra if you bed her by sunrise." The crowd erupted in jeers and whistles. The widow stiffened, retreating half a step. "You're drunk, Watson," Jacob said flatly. Maybe so, but my money's good. Watson's bloodshot eyes narrowed. Unless the great Jacob Harlow's gone soft. Jacob's pride ignited like dry brush in August. He knew he should walk away. But every eye in town watched, waiting to see if he'd back down. He never had. "Make it 300, Jacob said evenly. "And you've got a bet." The crowd roared. Before he could reconsider, Jacob turned to Morrison. 75 for the woman in black. Sold. The gavel struck with finality. Jacob stepped onto the platform and extended his hand. "Ma'am." She hesitated, then placed her gloved fingers in his. They trembled. "My name is Clara," she whispered through the veil. "Clara Thornton." The Wyoming sun bled crimson across the horizon as Jacob's wagon rolled out of town. Clara Thornton sat beside him. A study in stillness, wrapped in grief and black fabric. Redemption. Creek shrank behind them, but Jacob felt the weight of every gossiping tongue. "It's an hour to the ranch," he said, breaking the silence. "Road gets rough past Willow Creek." Clara didn't respond. Her hands rested in her lap. Black gloves, a stark contrast against the darker fabric of her dress. Jacob fought the urge to ask what lay beneath that veil. It wasn't his business. She was a means to an end, a way to put Buck Watson in his place. Yet with each passing mile, that justification rang hollow. When the Double H Ranch came into view, lantern light glowing in the windows, Jacob felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The house stood 2 stories tall, constructed of solid timber with a wraparound porch. It was the finest home for 50 miles. "This is your home now," Jacob said, helping her down from the wagon. "A house is not always a home, Mr. Harlow." Her voice carried a refined accent that surprised him, suggesting education beyond frontier expectations. Inside, the parlor smelled of oak smoke from the banked fire. Clara moved through it like a ghost, touching nothing, her veil still in place despite the privacy. "Would you like supper?" Jacob asked, awkward in his own kitchen. She shook her head. "I am tired. If you'll allow, I'd like to rest." He showed her to the upstairs room, the one with lace curtains his late mother had hung years ago. Clara paused in the doorway, gloved hands clutched tight. "Thank you," she whispered. Jacob nodded and left her there. But as he walked down the hall to his own room, Buck Watson's sneering voice returned. $300 if you bed her by sunrise. He clenched his fists. This wasn't about money. It was about pride, about not letting Watson make a fool of him. Yet when Jacob closed his eyes that night, he found no peace. From his window, he glimpsed Clara's veiled figure in the moonlit garden, her posture suggesting prayer or mourning. Who was this woman? What secret hid behind that veil? And why did her quiet dignity unsettle him more than any challenge Watson could offer? Dawn arrived, with pale fingers of light stretching across the plains. Jacob had barely slept, his conscience waging war with his pride. He dressed and headed downstairs, surprised to find Clara already awake. She stood at the stove, a pot of coffee brewing. "Good morning, Mr. Harlow," she said, her veil in place despite the early hour. "You didn't have to do that," Jacob said, gesturing toward the coffee. "I'm accustomed to early risings." Something in her tone suggested memories she'd rather forget, and I'm not one for idleness. As Jacob watched her pour coffee, he noticed how she managed to drink through her veil, a practiced motion that spoke of months behind that black fabric. Her hands moved with educated grace, revealing a life before whatever tragedy had brought her to Redemption Creek. "You know," he said, settling at the table. Folks are curious about you. A widow turning up at an auction without a name stirs questions. Clara's gloved hands tightened around her cup. I prefer not to speak of the past. You'll find the past has a way of following a person out here. For the first time, she turned directly toward him, even through the veil. Jacob felt her eyes pierce him, sharp and defiant. Then perhaps it is best you do not ask. Her tone silenced him. He, Jacob Harlow, a man feared for his stubbornness, had backed down after breakfast. Jacob showed her around the ranch. Clara moved with unexpected confidence, running gloved fingers over fence posts and garden plants with knowledge that surprised him. "You know something about agriculture," he observed. "My father owned a farm in Pennsylvania," she said, then fell silent, as if she'd revealed too much. By afternoon, Clara had arranged her few possessions in the upstairs room and had begun organizing the kitchen with quiet efficiency. Jacob watched her from the doorway, struck by how quickly she'd adapted to her surroundings. "Mr. Harlow," she said suddenly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you never marry? A man with your prosperity usually seeks an heir." The question caught him off guard. "Never found a woman worth the trouble," he answered gruffly. "Or never found a woman you couldn't control with money alone." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. Before Jacob could respond, hoofbeats announced a visitor. Tom Brennan rode into the yard, his expression grim. Jacob stepped outside to meet him. "What brings you here, Tom?" "News from town." Tom dismounted, glancing toward the house. "Buck Watson's been running his mouth all over Redemption Creek. Says you bought the widow on a dare." Jacob's jaw tightened. "Watson needs to mind his business. It's worse than that. Folks are taking bets now. Jacob, they're all waiting to see if you prove yourself or crawl away in shame." Behind them, the screen door creaked. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, a tea tray in her hands. It rattled slightly as her grip tightened. "A bet?" she asked, her voice low. Tom looked at Jacob, uneasy. "Maybe I said too much." But Clara's eyes fixed on Jacob, though the veil still covered her face. He felt the heat of her stare like fire. "Is it true?" Jacob's chest tightened. He wanted to deny it, to wash away the shame burning in him, but the truth hung between them like a noose. "Yes," he admitted. The tray clattered as Clara set it down, her hands shaking visibly now. Tea spilled across the polished wood. "So, I am nothing but a wager to you," she said, each word precise despite her trembling. "A game among men." Jacob stepped forward. "It isn't like that." "Then tell me what it is, Mr. Harlow." Her voice cracked, though she tried to steady it. "Because I crossed into this house thinking perhaps it was a chance for dignity. But if I am here only because of a drunken bet, Clara, please, then I am no better than cattle on the block." Her words struck deep, sharper than any blade. Jacob reached for her arm, but she pulled back, retreating toward the stairs, black dress whispering against the wood. Tom exhaled heavily. "You've stepped in something deep this time, Jacob. I didn't need you telling me that." Jacob raked a hand through his hair. "How much time before Watson comes collecting?" "He'll be here tomorrow, most likely, bringing half the town with him, I'd wager." After Tom left, Jacob stood in the parlor, staring into the cold fireplace. Night had fallen, the grandfather clock ticking away hours as he sat alone. What had begun as a matter of pride now felt like the lowest act of his life. Upstairs, Clara remained behind her closed door. No sound emerged, not even weeping. At midnight, Jacob climbed the stairs and knocked gently. "Clara, please, I'd like to explain." Silence answered him. "I know what I did was wrong," he continued, forehead pressed against the wooden door. "But I want you to know you're safe here. No matter what happens with Watson, you'll have a place at the Double H for as long as you want it." More silence. Jacob returned downstairs, pouring himself a whiskey he didn't really want. The amber liquid caught the lamplight like trapped fire. Was that how Clara felt? Trapped by circumstance, by men's pride, by whatever horror had driven her to hide her face from the world. The grandfather clock struck 2. Jacob had not slept a wink. His mind turned circles around the bet with Buck Watson, the veiled widow in the blue room, and the uneasy weight of shame that pressed against his chest. Then, a soft knock at his door. Jacob swung his legs out of bed, the lamplight throwing his shadow long across the floor. "Come in," he said. The door creaked, and Clara stepped inside. She was still cloaked in black, but there was a fragility about her, a trembling he hadn't seen before. "I won't waste your time. Mr. Harlow," she said, voice low but steady. "This wager of yours, I will settle it tonight." Jacob stood quickly. "You don't have to," but she was already unfastening the outer veil. It slipped away, revealing the finer mesh beneath, her hands, gloved but shaking, removed pin after pin. Each fell like a nail into silence. "My husband and child died in a fire," she whispered. Eyes never leaving his, "I lived, if this can be called living." The last veil lifted. The wig came away, and Jacob froze. Where soft hair should have been was scarred scalp. Where smooth skin should have shone were patches marred by fire's cruel kiss. Yet behind the scars were eyes, gray as a stormy horizon, fierce with defiance and raw with grief. "This is the truth," Clara said, chin rising, though her hands shook. "This is what your town would call a horror. This is what your Buck Watson paid to see. So now, sir, collect your winnings." The silence that followed was heavier than gun smoke after battle. Jacob stepped forward, slow, deliberate, until he stood so near he could see the freckles still surviving on her cheek beneath the scars. "No," he said, voice rough with conviction. "Watson wagered on shame, but there is no shame here. You've stood through fire and loss, and you're still standing, stronger than most men I know." Her eyes searched his face, desperate for the cruel laugh, the recoil, the disgust she'd come to expect. None came, instead. Jacob reached out, careful, steady, and touched her scarred cheek with the gentleness of a man handling something precious. "You asked if you were cursed," he said. "I'll tell you plain. You are a miracle, Clara Thornton. And tomorrow, when Buck comes sniffing for his entertainment, I'll pay him every cent and tell him I lost, because the truth of you stays with me, and no man has the right to use it for sport." Her lips parted, trembling. "Why?" "Because I see you," Jacob said simply. "Not what you lost, not what they took. You." For the first time in 14 months, Clara's composure broke. A single tear traced the line of her scar, falling onto Jacob's hand. "I came west because a doctor told me I might find peace in the open air," she whispered. "Instead, I found only more hiding, more shame, more men looking at me as property to be purchased." Jacob's hand remained on her cheek, his thumb gently brushing away the tear track. That ends now, tomorrow. I ride to town with $300 in my pocket. I'll pay Watson his money. Tell him I lost the bet, and warn him never to mention your name again. And then, Clara asked, the question hanging between them. And then you decide, Jacob answered. Stay or go, whatever you choose. It'll be your decision. Not mine, not Watson's, not any man's. Clara's hand covered his, the touch of her glove against his skin surprisingly warm. I have spent a year being afraid of what others might see. I had forgotten what it means to be seen. The storm outside rattled the window panes, but inside the Double H Ranch, something fragile had begun to take root. Morning arrived with the clean scent of rain-washed earth. Jacob dressed carefully, strapping on his gun belt more from habit than necessity. $300 waited in an envelope on his dresser, payment for a bet he'd never collect. Downstairs, he found Clara in the kitchen. She wore a simple dress, her scarred face uncovered in the gentle morning light, without the veil. Her expressions were clear, caution mixed with a fragile hope that made something twist in Jacob's chest. "You're going to town," she said. Not a question. Yes. Jacob poured coffee, studying her over the rim of his cup. To settle accounts with Watson. Clara nodded, her fingers tracing patterns on the kitchen table. What will you tell him? That I lost the bet, nothing more. He won't believe you. Doesn't matter what he believes, only matters what he knows. Jacob finished his coffee and reached for his hat. Clara followed him to the door, hesitating at the threshold. Mr. Harlow, Jacob, she said, stopping him before he stepped onto the porch. When you return, I'll be gone. He turned, something sharp catching in his throat. That's your choice to make. No, she said quickly. I mean, I'll be gone from this house. I'd like to stay in the cottage by the creek, the one your foreman mentioned. I need space, time to remember who I was before the fire, before the veil. Relief flooded through him. The cottage is yours for as long as you want it. And in return? Jacob shook his head. No returns, no payments. No deals. Everyone wants something, Jacob. Her voice held the wisdom of a woman who had learned this truth the hardest way. Then I want you to be exactly who you choose to be, nothing more or less. Clara stepped closer, reaching up to touch his face as he had touched hers the night before. Her fingers were bare now, the gloves discarded with her veil. In a land that trades in flesh and pride, Mr. Harlow, perhaps the greatest rebellion is to choose for oneself. Jacob covered her hand with his own, rough calluses against fire-smooth skin. Then we'll both be rebels. He rode toward town with purpose. The Double H spread out behind him like a kingdom. At the boundary fence, he turned in the saddle for one last look. Clara stood on the porch, face upturned to the Wyoming sky, scarred and beautiful in the morning light. For the first time since he'd built it, the ranch looked like more than property. It looked like home.